What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another episode of the best armies in 40k, the weekly video series where we go through large event results from the last weekend and look at undefeated armies. And this weekend, the weekend of May 25th and 26th, 2024, was absolutely huge, with multiple major level events going down, including the GT Andorra, Rocky Mountain Rumble, which was streamed by our friends over at Wargames Live, the Alamo GT, and Frontline Gaming's Bay Area Open. All of those being 100 or larger players. We also saw some large team events go down, including the May International Team Tournament and the CTC Championship, Isuaruin Team Tournament, and Trident Team Tournament. Although, as normal, I don't typically discuss team events in this series. The CTC Championship was streamed by our friends over at Tabletop Live, so if you want to see some team coverage, go check that out. And as a reminder, I will be live this weekend streaming the DreamHack Team Invitational, a showcase team tournament that will pull some of the best players in the country together to display the team format at the DreamHack Dallas esports event. So stay tuned to my calendar or subscribe to the YouTube channel for notifications for when those go live. Now, with all of these huge events going down, this is going to be a huge weekend to discuss, and we saw some absolutely nuts results, including a dominating result from Grey Knights, as well as non-Codex compliant Space Marines, and a little bit of a showcase from some Xenos, including Aeldari and Tyranids, and some Chaos. Thousand Suns did exceptionally well this weekend, as well as some Chaos Space Marines. Moving on to the Metagame Breakdown, we see that Grey Knights went undefeated at the Extra Sheet 3, Alamo GT, and GT Andorra, where they tied with Thousand Suns. Interestingly, both of those players went 7-0-1 after 8 rounds of 40k, tying in the finals at a 100-100 score. I don't know if that was an intentional draw or if that was played out to a 100-100 score. If it was played out, holy crap, that would have been an amazing game to watch. Space Marines also doing well, with Space Wolves, Blood Angels, and Dark Angels doing exceptionally well. Space Wolves was one of the highest number of event wins this weekend at Capital Clash, Dutch Masters, and War Calls GT. Dark Angels also taking down the Heroes of the Mid-Table Spring, as well as the Alamo GT, a large major level event with a 6-0 record. Blood Angels also taking down the South Yorkshire GT. Moving on to Thousand Suns, as I mentioned before, they did go undefeated and actually took the #1 spot at the GT Andorra, but we also saw them take down another large event, the Rocky Mountain Rumble, another 150-player major. And Aeldari did fairly well, taking down the Garage Hammer Legends as well as Capital Clash. Tyranids did take down an event at Tabletop Con. And last but certainly not least, we've got Chaos Space Marines with 2 undefeated results at Extra Shift 3 as well as the Frontline Gaming Bay Area Open. Now, as far as I know, both of these events use the old Chaos Space Marine Index as well as the outdated points values, since those were only updated last week to the new codex. And normally I don't talk about outdated event results in this series, but the new Chaos Space Marine Codex uses the Pact-Bound Zealot detachment, which is an almost identical recreation of Slaves to Darkness from the Chaos Space Marine Index, beyond a couple of minor mechanical changes. So I will still be discussing these lists, but before we dive into Chaos Space Marines, I do want to remind you to take these with a little bit of a grain of salt, since the rules that they were using for the armies are now outdated. And with that, let's dive into some lists, starting with Grey Knights, our psychic friends who had an incredibly successful weekend. And we're going to be talking about Alejandro Mancuso Serrano's list from the GT Andorra. Alejandro was running 2 Brotherhood Librarians, one of them with the Sigil of Exigence, the other one with no upgrades. There was a 5-model Brotherhood Terminator squad for one of those Librarians to jump into, and the list also included a Paladin squad of 5 Paladins that could have housed the other one. The Paladins are a very strong ranged force. They can bring lots of Terminator heavy weapon, and it looks like this unit was packing multiple incinerators, so the Sigil of Exigence Librarian may have joined into that squad to give them a reactive reposition in response to enemy ranged attacks. That allows them to jump in very close to your opponent. If they decide to move into you, you can port away with Mists of Deimos. If they shoot you, you can just Sigil of Exigence away, and you're stacking the damage from their Stormbolters, potentially their melee, and the Brotherhood Librarian's Vortex of Doom all together. Although those Brotherhood Librarians are just as good by themselves, to be fair. We also then had a Purifier squad, that one being led by Castellan Crow, alongside a 5-model Strike squad to add a little bit of OBSEC and a ton of vehicle supports. 3 Nemesis Dreadknights, as well as a Land Raider Redeemer to take up the midboard. It's been an interesting evolution to see Grey Knights move away from the all Nemesis Dreadknight builds after the most recent update, and to these more combined arms builds that are rocking multiple of these heavy infantry units that Grey Knights are famous for, backed up by their now relatively impressive armor and shooting, and it definitely looks like that's working out for them. Moving on to Space Marines, let's talk about the most effective Space Marine chapter of the weekend, Space Wolves, with 3 event wins. This list was piloted by Jordan Beresford at the War Calls GT. This is a classic Stormlance style of Space Wolves, the relatively standard version that we've been seeing recently, although this one had a ton of spice in it, including the inclusion of Bjorn the Fell-Handed to add a character Dreadnought, as well as his Vect effect, his CP tax. Harold Deathwolf, the almost unkillable captain character who rocks the mantle of the Troll King. This guy can be taken by himself. He's actually incredibly effective on his own. He has a pretty high volume 2 damage melee attack, plus his attacks from his Thunderwolf, and at once per phase can take 0 damage after failing a saving throw from an attack, meaning that he can use it multiple times per turn, up to potentially 4 times per battle round against most armies. He can join into one of the 3 Thunderwolf cavalry units that is in the list, or he can rock by himself, to be honest, if he wants to. We also saw a Copy Weapon Lieutenant, Logan Grimnar and Stormrider to join into another unit of Thunderwolf Cavalry, and a Thunderwolf Lord with Fury of the Storm to join into the 3rd. They were all attached in with Volfgard Battle Leaders on Thunderwolves, one of them with Hunter's Instincts, one of them with Portents of Wisdom, and we saw Ragnar Blackmane included in an Assault Intercessor squad. Ragnar Blackmane is an absolute beatstick by himself. He comes in at a whopping 10 attacks on the charge, giving him an absolutely ludicrous output for his points value. We have an Impulsor to house the Assault Intercessor squad, 2 Scout squads for utility, as well as a Whirlwind to add a little bit of indirect fire on top of those 18 Thunderwolf Cavalry. The Whirlwind is an interesting inclusion, gives you a little bit of counter battery to enemies who are trying as hard as they can not to engage the Thunderwolf Cavalry, and forces your opponent to move out aggressively and actually deal with the Space Wolf army, which is exactly what it wants, because it can descend upon you with its 20 plus cavalry models. Now that moves us on to the Space Wolves' longtime rivals, the Dark Angels, who took down several events this weekend, and we're going to be talking about the Alamo GT, a 100 plus player major, which was won by none other than Kit Smith Hanna. Kit was running an Ironstorm Spearhead. This is the kind of Lion Storm style of build that is led by Azrael to unlock some CP generation. It then also had the Triumvirate of Tech Marines, each of them with the Ironstorm Spearhead enhancements, Target Augury Web, Adept of the Omnissiah, and Master of Machine War to grant lethal hits within an aura, a blanked save once per round within an aura, as well as fallback or advance and shoot within an aura. We then had an Assault Intercessor squad, potentially for Azrael to hop into, 2 units of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors to act as relatively cheap utility units that are good at clearing enemy objectives, a Ravenwing Dark Shroud, 2 Redemptor Dreadnoughts to stand in front of that Dark Shroud, gaining stealth and bringing their innate -1 damage to bear, plus 2 Stormraven Gunships, which can potentially be disembarking those Redemptor Dreadnoughts early in the game to give them a little bit of an additional speed boost and then act as gunships. We then had a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to buff all of the shooting, and a Vindicator to act as another hardy bulwark. This gives you a huge front line of 2+ saves, some of them being -1 damage. The Stormraven Gunships only a 3+ save, but again, with that damage reduction effect, and all of that protected by stealth thanks to the Dark Shroud, buffed by the Target Augury Web, and potentially getting 5+ critical hits for lethal and sustained using Mercy as weakness. That can be fueled by Azrael, pumping the army full of command points. This is not a particularly new or innovative build, since we've seen it do extremely well over the course of the last several months, but it is cool to see those Stormravens still see some play after they received nerfs in the last update. And that moves us on to Blood Angels, where none other than Mikey from Hellstorm Wargaming, go check his channel out if you haven't already. I'm sure he's going to talk about his games in depth in a live stream later this week, went undefeated with the Sons of Sanguinius. Mikey was running a relatively standard variety of the Blood Angels chapter, running 2 captains attached to Assault Intercessor squads, a Jump Pack captain with Icon of the Angel, to attach into a 10-man Vanguard Veteran squad. He grants the squad +1 strength on the charge, and when combined with the bonus from the detachment ability, they can become up to strength 8 with an attached Sanguinary Priest as well. They also become AP 3, plus Lamarty's in a 10 model Death Company Marine squad, as well as the Sanguinor to jump in and muck with enemy counterattacks. The Sanguinar can jump in out of deep strike on enemy units that charge any Blood Angels units, meaning that once the Blood Angels engage and you're forced to charge back into them with your own counterpunchers to kill them, the Sanguinar can come in, muck up with your pile in and consolidate move, strike first to kill a bunch of models in your unit, and then even if he dies, use Angel Sacrifice to give your unit rerolls against them. He is relatively expensive, but incredibly effective for what you get. We then had 2 Impulsors to bring the Assault Intercessor squads along. Interestingly, no Land Raider Redeemers in this list, which is a staple of the list, but the Impulsors give those 2 Assault Intercessor squads with their attached captains a lot more flexibility when moving around the table, rather than being tied to the single Redeemer, which can be move blocked or avoided. We then had 2 Ball Predators to basically take the spot. Instead of having 2 short-range flamethrowers on one chassis, you get 2 long-range Ball Flamestorm cannons on 2 individual chassis that have a fairly impressive threat range thanks to their ability to advance and shoot infantry with those flamers, plus a Calidus Assassin and a Scout Squad for utility, and 10 Death Company Marines to join in with Lamarties. It's interesting to see this style of list played without a Redeemer. Typically, that is the kind of mainstay bulwark of the list, but the Ball Predators are definitely effective and a good stand-in if you don't want to be playing the Redeemer. And that moves us on away from the Space Marine super faction into Chaos. We'll talk about Thousand Suns today, which actually had a fairly good weekend, with Noah Neuendorfer going undefeated at the Rocky Mountain Rumble, and Taraxor El Rojo going undefeated at the GT Andorra. He was able to go 7-0-1 at an 8-round event, again with that 100-point draw recorded for the final round. Don't know what happened there, but if it was 2 100 scores, that would be absolutely insane. Taraxor was running Ahriman on foot, plus 3 Exalted Sorcerers on Discs of Tzeentch to add a little bit of control, as well as the ability to move aggressively forward, score secondaries, and get their Kabbalistic Rituals into range. We had an Infernal Master with the Arcane Vortex, the ever-present Super Flamer Screamer Invocation guy with a Strength 7 2 damage Torrent weapon, alongside his ability to automatically convert attacks into devastating wounds, Magnus the Red, and a Thousand Suns Sorcerer with the Lord of Forbidden Lore. He's hard to shoot at because he prevents enemy ranged attacks from targeting him outside 18 inches. So as long as he's attached to a Rubric squad, he can actually play a little aggressively with that Lord of Forbidden Lore to get duplicate Kabbalistic Rituals in range. We then had the classic 5 units of Rubric Marines. We're sort of back to the Rubric Marine spam of the days of yore. All of those packing tons and tons of Warp Flamers to attach most of the characters into. 1,000 Suns Rhino to give them a little bit of additional threat range, keep them alive from indirect fire. One interesting thing you can do with the Rhino as well is embark some of the sorcerers into it and use your firing deck to fire the sorcerers out the top. It is actually relatively easy to get them within 6 inches of Magnus if they are inside the Rhino, because the Rhino's chassis is much physically larger than a single sorcerer, meaning that the range you're drawing to enemies can be farther away than it would be if you were just measuring from your own 40mm base. And that allows you to get +1 to hit and wound on those psychic attacks much more easily. If you're not using stratagems on those guys, or you need the Kabbalistic Ritual points that they would normally generate, the Rhino actually becomes a relatively effective gun platform when palling around with Magnus. We then had a Mutalith Vortex Beast, as well as 1 unit of Thousand Suns Cultists to add a little bit of utility and resilience to the list and expand the range of those Kabbalistic Rituals. Now, one thing that I do want to point out here, especially at the Rocky Mountain Rumble, is that we didn't see Orcs winning any events this week, but we did see them place very highly, and they did take down the Rocky Mountain Rumble with 3 out of the top 4 players being Orcs, the last one being Thousand Suns. Now, Thousand Suns, at least according to several players that I've spoken to recently, have a very good matchup into armies like Grey Knights, which, as we talked about earlier, are doing very well. And in my opinion, they also have a favorable matchup into Orcs. So if Orcs are seeing a lot of play thanks to the release of their new codex, they are definitely going to be buoying the effectiveness of Thousand Suns on top of that. Thousand Suns also have a fairly good matchup into most Space Marine chapters, because Space Marines rely very heavily on strong armor saves and mass devastating wounds, and armor save ignoring, thanks to Twist of Fate, is an excellent way to take down their large Land Raiders and other heavily armored vehicles and Death Star units. And it definitely feels like Thousand Suns are poised to do extremely well this season if they don't get knocked down a peg by the incoming Chaos Space Marines. We'll see how that matchup plays out, and I'm so excited because the story of Thousand Suns is always an interesting one. Now, speaking of interesting stories, let's talk about some Xenos. Let's move on to Aeldari, who took down the Capital Clash down in Australia, with Dale Mann going undefeated at that event. Dale was running a battle host led by an Autarch Wayleaper, also including Fuigan the Firelord and Yvraine. Although Yvraine obviously was not the warlord, the Autarch Wayleaper was the warlord to unlock his command point regeneration. Yvraine was just in there to attach into a huge unit of Harlequin troopers. She grants that unit a 5+ feel no pain and the ability to return destroyed bodyguard models to the unit, as well as bringing a effective AP3 2 damage melee attack with devastating wounds on top of the already strong melee profiles that the Harlequin troops have. Plus, they're able to give that attack +1 to wound thanks to their Harlequin assault, making that unit a fairly effective melee counterpunch that not a lot of Aeldari armies have access to. The list also included a unit of 10 Storm Guardians, as well as a Wave Serpent, 3 units of Dark Reapers, 2 units of Rangers, 2 units of Shadow Specters, 2 units of Swooping Hawks, 3 units of Warp Spiders, and 2 Skyweavers. This is a style of Eldar that is kind of a blast from the past, but is becoming more popular over the last couple of weeks, since the faction doesn't rely so much on their big heavy tanking units like the Avatar of Cain, Wraith Knights, or Wraithguard. It's focusing more heavily on taking tons and tons of smaller units. And those Dark Reapers can come in and clear out opposing aggressive infantry or utility units with their indirect fire Tempest launchers to be able to clear the path for these massive numbers of Eldar Aspect Warriors to score insane numbers of points. Eldar are generally fairly effective at dealing damage if they can combine their fire on a single target, since the large number of units in the army gives you additional chances to roll well on your individual attacks, meaning that they can focus fire down larger targets whenever they need to, and while doing so, score infinite points using the Skyweaver's Swooping Hawk's redeployment ability or the Warp Spider's extreme speed to jump everywhere they need to on the table and constantly be scoring out their secondaries. Now, speaking of scoring out secondaries, let's continue to talk about Australian events, because we are going to jump over to the Tabletop Con where Tyranids went undefeated, where Tyranid legend Eric Lathuris went undefeated with a Synaptic Nexus list. Eric was running the Death Leaper, a Neurotyrant with power of the Hive Mind, as well as a Turvagon with Synaptic Control, coming in at toughness 11 with a 2+ save and a massive 16 wounds. The -1 damage from that Synaptic Control makes this thing an absolute pain in the ass to kill. We then also had a Winged Tyranid Prime with the Dirge Heart of Karis to give it a -1 leadership aura to further improve the effectiveness of the army's leadership affecting attacks. Combined with Death Leaper and potentially even the Neurotyrant's -1 to the battle shock checks caused by Shadow and the Warp, you can make large swaths of your opponent's army almost automatically fail those leadership checks. Now, we don't have any attachments for the Winged Tyranid Prime, so he is simply in here as a unit that can hop in, jump into a relevant position, and bomb your opponent with tons and tons of leadership debuffs. We then had 2 units of Hormagaunts as well as 2 units of Termagants to get buffed by and regenerated by that Turvagon with Synaptic Control. That controls the midboard, and with the Hormagaunts, jumps into your opponent's side and steals their objectives very effectively. We backed that up with a Biovore to score secondaries passively, 2 Exocrines and a Maleceptor to deal damage at range, with the Maleceptor being a little bit more of a short-ranged tank, plus 2 Neurolictors to debuff enemy units, and a Pyrovore. Last, and certainly not least in the army, were 3 Molochs. Now, the Moloch is an interesting unit. They deep strike normally 9 inches away from enemies, but when they do so, every enemy unit within 12 inches has the chance to take mortal wounds and potentially take a battle shock check. You can again stack the leadership debuffs that the army already has access to make those battle shock checks pretty reasonable to fail. And the Moloch's melee profile, well, it doesn't look too exciting from the get-go, has a trillion relatively mediocre attacks. Once you're buffed by effects like the Neurolictor, as well as the Goaded to Slaughter detachment ability for +1 to hit, and rerolls with Irresistible Will, these guys can actually put out pretty reasonable damage and be relatively tanky at toughness 10 for a very reasonable points value, in addition to doing some free mortal wounds to your opponent's army. Rapid ingressing these guys can also force battle shock checks when your opponent's not expecting them at the end of their own movement phase, which will then, if they fail them, carry over onto future turns, and having a massive number of huge deep strikers is again very good at scoring out objectives passively. This is an absolutely insane style of Tyranid list, using these Termagant Horde with the Turvagon to hold down the midboard, while absolutely surrounding the opponent using tons and tons of big deep striking worms. And you love to see lists like these roll out to an undefeated result. And with that, we will move on to our last faction of the day, Chaos Space Marine. Again, at least to my knowledge, unless the lists submitted were playing with different points values, they used the old rules. However, you can transmute adapt those rules to the Pact-Bound Zealots detachment in the new Chaos Space Marines Codex without too much difficulty. Today we're going to be talking about Adam Dye's Chaos Space Marines that went 6-0 at the Bay Area Open. Adam was running Abaddon the Despoiler plus 2 Warpsmiths, both of those with Mark of Slaanesh. Now, the Warpsmiths were there to fuel a Chaos Vindicator Wombo combo. This was a combination that was really held up by a lot of Chaos Space Marine players once the Vindicator points value had been reduced, since it was already a relatively good datasheet, but at a fairly expensive points cost. These Chaos Vindicators come stock with the Mark of Nurgle, giving them 5+ critical hits when shooting if they use their Dark Pact for sustained hits. However, they will also be getting lethal hits when buffed by the nearby Nurgle Hellbrute. They can get +1 to hit from the Warpsmith and full hit rerolls from Abaddon's reroll aura. At that stage, the Vindicator can fire its main cannon, take any non-5-up hits that it rolls, and reroll them with a pretty reasonable chance that they will at the very least hit, since 2 of those 3 Vindicators are hitting on 2s thanks to the nearby Warpsmiths. Any additional 5-ups that they roll are going to give them an additional lethal and sustained hit, and with an average of 7-ish attacks from these things, you can expect them to get 3 or 4 lethal and sustained combinations from each of those Vindicator shots. Those are automatic wounds, and you're picking up all the other dice plus sustains from those criticals and rolling strength 14 wounds against your opponent again, forcing your opponent to take probably 7 or 8 saves from each Vindicator shot. These things are so deadly, they kill basically anything in line of sight and range of the army. We then had an Undivided Forge Fiend to add a little bit more long-range firepower with its ectoplasma cannons, a unit of 4 Obliterators. This unit is one that we won't see in the future, since they are only going to be able to be taken in units of 2. We may still see the Obliterators themselves, but definitely not the big 4-man unit, which makes stratagems more efficient when used on them. A unit of Slaaneshi Raptors to add some fast, aggressive units that could flip objectives. Those guys were packing 2 Meltaguns as well, so they could move up very quickly and add a little bit of additional anti-tank shooting. 3 units of Nurglings, a Cultist Mob, and a Legionnaire squad with Mark of Khorne to add utility. Now, while I don't think this list will survive perfectly moving on into the new Codex, especially with those Obliterators that are inside it, I do think that the Vindicator plus Abaddon combo is going to be fairly effective. Now, Abaddon did get a little bit less effective since his ability to regenerate command points is not quite as good as it was in the Index. However, he will be getting a small points decrease, which can help smooth that over a little bit. All right, I said that would be the last list, but I lied to you. You can never trust anything I say ever again. I have one more I want to talk about because I have some extra time. This one from the Grimdark 21 GT. It was a 4-0-1 result, which I don't typically talk about unless I have some additional time to spend, but this one was using Imperial Knights. Bjorn Eriksson taking the faction to an undefeated record, rocking none other than Canis Rex himself, followed up by a ton of Armigers, doing his best War Dog impression from Chaos Knights. Canis Rex was backed up by 4 Armiger Hellbrunds, as well as 6 Armiger Warglaves, for a grand total of 10 Armiger class Knights, in addition to a Calidus Assassin for utility. This list went up against Dark Angels in the finals, ended up tying them. It was a relatively normal looking Lionstorm sort of Ironstorm Spearhead list, like with the one that we talked about earlier in this video, so they ended up tying for first place in the event. But with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. A huge weekend for the game and some absolutely insane results. Let me know down in the comment section which list was your favorite and what you think of these undefeated lists, and big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I absolutely love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.